Disciplinary literacy refers to the specialized ways that experts in a field create, communicate, and evaluate knowledge. In history, this means that reading is not about finding the main idea or summarizing facts. Instead, historians question sources. They situate text within a historical context and interpret evidence to construct arguments about the past. Disciplinary literacy is not a generic strategy. It is deeply tied to how historians think and work. Disciplinary literacy matters because history is an interpretive discipline. If students are only asked to recall dates and events, they miss the intellectual work of history. We teach disciplinary literacy. We help students understand that historical knowledge is constructed, contested, and supported by evidence. These skills also prepare students to evaluate historical claims they encounter in media, politics, and everyday life. At its core, disciplinary literacy in history involves analyzing primary and secondary sources, evaluating perspective and bias, and constructing evidence-based interpretations. Historians read documents differently depending on who created them, when they were created, and for what purpose. Teaching disciplinary literacy means making these expert practices visible to students instead of assuming they will happen automatically. One essential disciplinary literacy strategy in history is sourcing. Sourcing requires students to examine who created a document, when it was created, and why it was produced. Before students ever read, they consider the author's position, intended audience, and possible bias. For example, when analyzing a political pamphlet from the Revolutionary era, students might ask whose interests the author represents and how that shapes the message. Another key strategy historians use is corroboration. This means comparing multiple sources related to the same event or issue. Students learn to look for agreements, contradictions, and gaps across texts. Through corroboration, students begin to understand that no single source tells the full story of the past. Instead, historical understanding emerges from weighing evidence across sources. Contextualization is another essential disciplinary literacy strategy. Contextualization requires students to place a document within its broader historical time period. Students consider what's happening politically, socially, economically, and culturally when the source was created. By understanding the historical context, students can better interpret meaning and avoid judging the past using present-day assumptions. For example, when reading a speech from the Great Depression, students could examine how economic hardship shaped the author's arguments and concerns. Close reading of primary sources helps students examine historical texts carefully and deliberately. Historians read slowly, paying attention to key words, phrases, tone, and language choices. Students learn to analyze how word choice reflects perspective, purpose, and historical conditions. Through close reading, students move beyond surface-level comprehension. They develop deeper interpretations that are grounded in evidence. This approach will support students in understanding complex historical documents. A final disciplinary literacy strategy in history is constructing evidence-based claims or arguments. Students use evidence from primary and secondary sources to support historical interpretations. Rather than slowly summarizing information, students learn to make claims and justify them with specific evidence. This process mirrors the work of historians who must defend their interpretations using credible sources. By constructing evidence-based claims, students develop critical thinking skills and learn to engage in historical argumentation. Explicit strategy instruction is very important for us to teach. We need to model sourcing questions. Who wrote this? Why? When? Before students read any document. We need to make sure our lessons are rich in primary sources. It's important that we demonstrate how to use graphic organizers and annotation. We need to provide our students with the symbols or the digital tools so that they can actively mark bias, tone, and gaps while they read. It's important that we include in our lessons multiple perspective activities. Have students compare 2 or more accounts of the same event. Make sure that our lesson units start with open-ended questions. To what extent was Paul Revere's ride the main reason the British marched on Lexington? And then require our students to have evidence to back up their opinions. Make sure we teach our students and give them plenty of practice in argument writing with claim, evidence, reasoning. Make sure that they can write short claims supported by 2 to 3 pieces of evidence and explain how the evidence supports the claim. When we're teaching, make sure that we are using scaffolded gradual release. You model first, then you help the students with guided practice together, and then comes the independent close reading and claim building. Digital tools can really strengthen disciplinary literacy. Here are 2 examples of websites that can assist you. The Sanford Reading Like a Historian offers free lessons, and it's good for sourcing, contextualization, and corroboration. Additionally, it helps with close reading of primary sources. You could go into this account and click on Lessons of Paul Revere, and it will provide Paul Revere's own letters and accounts of what happened, plus a British officer's report and a later textbook version. You could allow your students to individually source each document. Who wrote it? When? Why? What's the bias in each one? Have the students gather in pairs and fill a chart with agreements and contradictions. Then you could take the whole class and build a claim. To what extent was Paul Revere the key figure, using evidence from at least 2 sources? The second source that I listed, Google Arts and Culture, is great because you can have your students virtually look at art and exhibits from different areas. This will help with contextualization. They can explore the art and the environment, the posters and personal items that people had during different historical periods. There are real-world applications to teaching disciplinary literacy. Learning to detect bias and learning how to source information are skills that can help students spot misinformation. Engaging in the literacy strategies helps students support critical thinking skills. And these critical thinking skills are very important. It will turn them into informed voting and help them recognize bias in modern news media and social media, which is really, really important. There are some challenges that could come if you're not already doing closed reading. Students might feel uncomfortable with the new structure, the new ambiguity to the structure. And there's always the issue of limited instructional time. I would like to encourage you that instead of simplifying the task, you practice the scaffolding that we mentioned earlier and keep the complexity and just teach them how to read and think critically like historians through guided practice and repeating the practice. When implementing disciplinary literacy, it's important to start small, use primary sources rather than lengthy texts, model your thinking aloud to students, let them hear how historians ask questions. Instead of adding new lessons, you could embed disciplinary literacy practices into the inquiry units you already teach. The goal is not more content, but deeper engagement with existing content. To summarize, disciplinary literacy in history focuses on how historians construct knowledge through sourcing, corroboration, and interpretation. These practices support close reading, critical thinking, and evidence-based argumentation. When students learn to think like historians, they gain skills that extend far beyond the history classroom. The research supporting disciplinary literacy emphasizes the importance of explicitly teaching discipline-specific ways of thinking, especially in secondary classrooms. These are the sources that were used to create this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.